Of its recent completed review of implementation on a report on government's emergency response action plan on gender-based violence and femicide. I know that's a mouthful. The report is based on a review of the government's implementation of the 6 months emergency response action plan that was rolled out in October 2019 to deal with the country's escalating scourge of gender-based violence and femicide. Let's take you there live.
Total of 80 targets, only 17 targets, which is equivalent of 21.25% were fully achieved. And it further shows that out a total of 12 targets, which is an equivalent of 15%, were partially achieved. Most of the targets, which is totaling to 51 or equivalent of 63.75%, were not achieved. Let me repeat that. Total of 51, 63% of the 80% targets set were not achieved. Our view, therefore, says that we have identified several key operational challenges that we believe served to undermine the implementation of the Emergency Response Action Plan initiative and ultimately led to many important targets not being achieved. Amongst these challenges that we identified, we can mention the following. Challenges related to the effective coordination of departmental activities across thematic areas, as mentioned before, that there was a total of 22 departments that were supposed to implement the ERAP initiatives. The second challenge that we identified was that there was greater emphasis on quantitative or observable outputs without clear linkages to the long-term qualitative outcomes in terms of combating gender-based violence as anticipated in the 5 thematic areas of the Emergency Response Action Plan initiatives. The third challenge that we identified was that there were specific targets, and these specified targets were not based on clear and rigorous assessment of current institutional capacity, needs, and responsible government departments and related entities. The fourth one that we identified as a challenge was that there was inadequate provision for systematic, ongoing monitoring and evaluation of progress in the implementation of interventions as well as targets set. Last challenge identified was that there was weak mechanisms for post-implementation impact assessment in relation to the specified interventions and targets under the 5 thematic areas mentioned earlier. Therefore, the findings contained in this report that we are launching today proudly lead us to put forward the following recommendations that we believe will assist government in addressing some of the challenges identified in the report. And these recommendations are as follows. The Commission for Gender Equality recommended that government undertakes a thorough review and evaluation of the implementation of the Emergency Response Action Plan to assess the achievements of the various targets as well as the challenges encountered. The findings of such a review and evaluation should be made public to inform citizens as well as stakeholders of some of the key challenges and lessons learned or the lessons that emerged out of the Emergency Response Action Plan initiatives so that we can plan better moving forward. The review and evaluation of the Emergency Response Action Plan should be carried out by a competent and independent service provider. It should identify key challenges, lessons learned, and prospects for the continued implementation of some of the main interventions and critical targets, including long term time frames and the intended positive consequences in the fight against gender-based violence. Given the Interim Steering Committee on Gender-based Violence and Femicide, this structure was abolished in April 2020, as its existence was supposed to be 6 months between October 2019 and March 2020. It is recommended, therefore, that in the short to medium term, the overall responsibility to drive government intervention programs to deal with gender-based violence be placed squarely under a competent institutional structure or a department, and this entity will oversee such national programs, including the process of establishing the National Multi-Stakeholder Body on Gender-based Violence. We further recommended that priority and the necessary resources be given to establishing the National Multi-Stakeholder Coordinating Body on Gender-based Violence. It's further recommended that the necessary legislative processes be intended to ensure or be initiated to ensure that such a multi-stakeholder body has the requisite legal standing and access to regular funding. The Commission for Gender Equality, as a critical stakeholder and as a member of the national gender machinery, should engage with the Ministry of Women, which today is placed in the presidency and known as the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities. This institution or this ministry and other relevant stakeholders should actually look at issues of proper planning and looking at planning processes, timeframes for the establishment of this multi-stakeholder body. So the National Strategic Plan on Gender-based Violence and Femicide, which has recently been approved by Cabinet, has its implementation, which is enshrined in the National Strategic Plan, and this should be the responsibility of the National Multi-Stakeholder Coordinating Body on Gender-based Violence. And this body is a body that can be known, or that was sometimes referred to as the National Gender-based Violence Council when we parted ways and when we had the declaration during the 2018 presidential summit that was held between the 1st and the 2nd of November in 2018. Therefore, while the process of establishing the multi-stakeholder body is still underway, it's recommended that the responsibility for the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-based Violence and Femicide be placed squarely under this Ministry of Women in the Presidency, or known as the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disabilities. We further recommended that this particular department or ministry in the presidency should initiate a consultative process for planning, for costing, and for budgeting and implementation, as well as monitoring and evaluation of the National Strategic Plan and the reports, in line with what we call the gender-responsive planning, budgeting, monitoring and evaluation, as well as audit. Progress to Parliament should actually be reported by this body. This responsibility should also reside within this department until such time as the National Multi-Stakeholder Coordinating Body on Gender-based Violence and Femicide is ready to assume its role and responsibility and execute these functions. It is therefore recommended that the Commission for Gender Equality engages with the Department of Women, Youth, and Persons with Disability regarding planning processes and timeframes for the implementation of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-based Violence and Femicide. One of the key interventions identified in the Emergency Response Action Plan was the implementation of the gender responsive budgeting or budget framework, which was introduced by the Ministry of Women in the presidency and approved by Cabinet in 2019. It is therefore recommended that this framework be widely disseminated and popularized across government departments at national, provincial, and local government levels. It's further recommended that the National Treasury plays a leading role in ensuring that the framework is adopted and implemented accordingly. As part of its constitutional and legislative mandate, the Commission for Gender Equality should utilize its powers provided for under the CGE Act number 39 of 1996, as well as other appropriate national legislations to hold government in general and specific departments accountable for ongoing implementation of national policies and legislative frameworks that we have in the country. This includes national strategies, as well as the National Strategic Plan on Gender-based Violence and programs of actions, for example, the Presidential Summit declarations on the IRAP to combat gender-based violence. We also are reminded of the 3 bills that the Commission for Gender Equality has actually made inputs into, and those 3 amendment bills were
We seem to have lost audio on that briefing, and we'll endeavor to take you back there as soon as we're able to, but you're still watching the agenda. Let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment.